Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We are from Group 6 and we have the opportunity to discuss with all of you about our material entitled Stage 1 Analyzing Events, Exposing Basic Elements in Story Structure. But let me introduce ourselves. I'm Dewanta Utomo, and here I'm with my friends Syaharani Hamidah, Adib Yudhitama, and Adib Alfaie. Okay, in this presentation, we will discuss about the first stage in analyzing the story with narratology. Namely, by analyzing the events in the story, our presentation will be divided into 5 sections. First, we will learn to recognize structural theory and the concept of involved in analyzing the story. Second, we will provide examples and ways of analyzing events in structural theory. Third, we will discuss how to determine the main and side events in a story. And fourth, we will discuss a little about how to determine the rules for the genre of romance stories. And finally, our group will discuss the result of our analysis on the story written by Adisha Citra Ramadhani entitled Teman Terbaik. Structural theory. Let me point out that our group is focused on analyzing stories with structural theory. In this connection, structural theory is a theory that avoids the concepts of aesthetic and aims to expose conventions or rules as opposed to uniqueness, which are the system of rules that underline certain genre in literary works. In contrast to stylistic theory, which uses the concept of aesthetic tools in its analytical works, structural theory uses the concept of elements, which can be defined as certain components that are parts of the whole structure. For example, red is one of the elements in the traffic light structure. Horses, rooks, and pawns are some of the elements in the structure of the game of chess. Through the element of traffic light and chess games, the meaning is embedded. Then the question is, what are the elements of a story structure? In this case, a romance story. According to structural theory, the basic elements in the structure of the story are events. When one event is linked with another event, a story is formed. At least two series of events are sufficient to form a story.
For a better understanding, here are examples of event analysis by applying structural theory. Now please look at the slide. We are showing a mini-fiction entitled Halte. How many events are there in this mini-fiction? The answer is only 5. Number 1. Cow. Character is waiting for the angkot at the bus stop while nodding off. And then cow, character, does that every day. Number 3, the angkot comes. And number 5, cow character gets on the angkot. And the last one, cow character saw himself still waiting for the angkot at the stop while nodding off. Besides that, what makes this short story really a story? Isn't this too short to be called a story? We will repeat the notion that according to structural theory, the basis elements in the structure of the story are events. When one event is linked with another event, a story is formed. At least two series of events are sufficient to form a story. So if an event beside only showing the first 2 points, that too can be considered a story. Once we understand structural theory, we must be able to define main events and side events. We need to make a distinction between the main event and the side event because it is often possible in no longer to add many events that are not always important to the overall structure of the story. However, how to determine the importance of position events in the story? The answer is question. We must consider the rules of the story genre itself. For example, in the romance genre, falling in love should be the main event. Romance writers struggle to think about falling in love. That's all how to process this event into something unique and interesting. However, any aesthetic technique employed by the author is profound in the story. Falling in love is must in the love story. That's the basic rule. Furthermore, side event will be associated with these main events. Apart from considering the genre, we can determine the main and side events with the 3 criteria suggested by Mieke Bal, one of the structural studies expert from Netherlands. That is by determining the position of the event. First, change the criteria. If you want to determine the position of an event according to change criteria, then you need to count the event as an event that will drive the next event. In other words, the event must bring about the potential for change. Second, choice criteria. An event must be open or contain options. For example, does the meeting between 2 characters in a romance story being romance or not? Then the rest, the readers are left to guess, and they just have to imagine a selection of events that might occur. And the last one is confrontation criteria, which contain the contradictory events. These 3 criteria do not have to be all selected to determine the position of the events. Means, if with one of the criteria we are able to make a decision, then other criteria do not need to be used. Okay, now look at the slide. Here is a piece of text from a short story entitled Pertemuan by Dewanta. We will try to determine the main events using the 3 criteria we discussed earlier. Criteria for change. The event meeting Cleo and the young man on the bus because their seats are next to each other. The event of this meeting is very important in the story because it was what changed the course of the story, namely the feeling of falling in love within Cleo. And then selection criteria. The meeting between Cleo and the young man also fulfills the selection criteria. That is, in this case, whether the meeting brings romance or not. And the last one is confrontation criteria. In this short story, there are conflicting events, namely between forgetting about romance in the past and the emergence of feelings of romance in the present. By taking into account one or all of these criteria, we can determine the main event in the short story pertemuan appropriately. In short, if we try to sort it chronologically, the main events in the short story pertemuan are as follows. Number 1, Cleo broke up. Then Cleo goes to Yogyakarta to forget about her ex-boyfriend. And on the way to Yogyakarta, Cleo meets Raditya, who looks like his ex-boyfriend. Next, Cleo falls in love with Raditya. And then Cleo and Raditya part ways uncomfortably because it turned out that Raditya was still in love with his girlfriend. And the last, Cleo and Raditya meet again by chance at the Skaten night market and repeat their intimacy.
Let's move on to the next slide. So in previous slide we have shown the 6 main event in this story. The other event apart from the main event, apart from the 6 main event in the story, is considered as a side story, as a side event, because of course they do not have the criteria of main events. The example of side event in this story is like when Cleo buying ticket in the again, and Cleo father taking Cleo to the bus terminal, and when Cleo reading the book. This event only serve as a support to the main event. Okay, let's move on into the next slide. We will see there is a chart in here. This is the material that we discussed in this presentation. The first one is there is a structural theory. Structural theory dismantles convention or rules. In its analytical word, structural theory uses the concept of elements as a component of the overall structure. And this element, if examined more fundamentally, will have events as the basic element in the structure of the story. And then we can distinguish event into main event and side events. And how we differentiate between main event and side event, we can use the technique by Mike Ball. There is 3 criteria in this technique. The first one is change criteria, and then choice criteria, and the last one is confrontation criteria. Next is determining the rules of romance story. This group will only talk briefly about this topic because it will be further explained by the next group. Okay, a rule in a story is something that sometimes we don't aware of, we just stick with it like it's just like a habit. For example, when we write a story, of course we obey a story system or story rules, but because we used to it, we just do it without realize that we follow a rule. We only realize the principle of storytelling when we had to create another story that we are not familiar with. Therefore, the awareness of story rules and system is very important to understand and interpret story in certain genre. Each genre has its own rules. For example, the rules in the romance story of course different with thriller story. Based on structural theory, story rules can be analyzed at 2 levels. The first one is the generally accepted level of event structuring rules. The second is the level of event structuring rules that apply to the genre. Next is basic element of romance story. In romance story, of course, falling in love is the main event. The writer of romance stories are always struggling to think about the event of falling in love. They struggling in how to make this main event of falling in love more unique or interesting for the readers.
From our study on the previous analysis, we will try to present our analysis on a paragraph fragment from the short story Teman Terbaik by Adisa Citra Ramadhani. First of all, we must determine the main event in the short story fragment. First, we have a criteria for change. On page 69 of the first paragraph, the events of Faika and Alfian arrive at Davin's painting exhibition as events that will further encourage events and create the potential for change, because this event will pave the way for new events that refer to new problems and will later become the main topic of discussion in this story. Second, selection criteria. The incident where Faika found Davin Kalisa Gantari's painting, like the one in the middle of page 71, the meeting between Faika and Kalisa Gantari was in painting, has met the selection criteria. This criterion means that the event must be open or contain options. When finally Faika found out that Davin had someone he liked, it made Faika doubt whether Davin would love him back or not. As long as we are within this criteria of choice, we as readers are left guessing, imagining our choice of events that might occur next. And last, we have confrontation criteria. In this short story, the incident when Davin told Faika about Kalisa Gantari that never disappeared from Davin's memory, as seen on page 72 at the end of the paragraph, shows that Davin could not forget his past rather than repay Faika's feeling. By paying attention to any or all of these criteria, we can accurately determine the main event in the short story Teman Terbaik. In short, if ordered chronologically, the main events in the short story are as follows. First is when Faika and Alfian arrive at Davin's painting exhibition, like at the beginning of page 69. Second, when Davin introduced his expired painting to Faika, seen on page 71, lower paragraph. Third, Faika wonders if the woman in Davin's painting is the woman Davin loves, as the beginning of page 72. Fourth, Davin could not forget his past instead of repaying Faika's feelings, like at the end page of 72. Events other than the sixth event will be classified as side events because they do not meet the above criteria. Side events include, first, the incident when Alfian bought the ticket and received the catalog as at the beginning of page 69. Second, the incident when Faika and Alfian began to tour and explore painting as in the last paragraph on page 69. Third is incident Davin mistook Alfian as Faika's lover at the beginning of page 71. This event only serves to complement the main event, so it deserves to be appointed as a side event. Of all our learning for today, bring us to the final session. From our discussion, we from Group 6 can conclude that in this determine the main and side event in the short story, it is necessary to analyze us using three criteria. First is criteria for change, criteria for choice, and the criteria for confrontation. Thank you so much for participating. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.